In 1942, the best Allied generals made the smartest decision they could. They abandoned Timor. Churchill backed it from London, MacArthur approved it from Manila. The Dutch signed the surrender without hesitation. Abandoning Timor was the right call. It was logical. It was what any trained military mind would have done when facing 15,000 Japanese soldiers, tanks, heavy artillery, and 200 aircraft. Only one army was stubborn enough to make the wrong decision. 260 men. And that stubbornness changed the Pacific War. I spent weeks going through files at the Australian War Memorial, declassified DVA records and campaign diaries that never made the headlines to bring you this documentary. What you're about to hear doesn't appear in American history books, it doesn't appear in British ones either. Only in Australian ones. 260 commandos were left alone on the 23rd of February, 1942, with an impossible order: deny Timor to Japan, no reinforcements, no escape route. No ally willing to come back for them. But here's what nobody tells you. Those 260 men didn't just survive. They forced Japan to tie down 15,000 soldiers for 10 months. And while they did it, the Timorese people who had never seen an Australian before 1941, started calling them something: the Australian Spirits. Now, to understand how 260 men got to that point, you need to understand what they were doing in Timor in the first place, and why nobody else was willing to stay. On the 7th of December, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor and shattered the illusion that the Pacific could stay out of the war. Within days, every military planner in the world was recalculating the map. And on that map, there was one island that suddenly became critical. Timor, 500 kilometres north of Darwin, split between Portugal in the east and the Netherlands in the west, technically neutral, strategically impossible to ignore. Why? Because Timor was the air bridge between Australia and the rest of the Allied forces in the Pacific. The airfields at Dili and Penfui were the last refueling points before Java, before the Philippines, before the front line. If Japan took Timor, Darwin was exposed. If Darwin fell, Australia stood alone. That turned a divided colonial island into the most important piece of real estate in the South Pacific. On the 17th of December, 1941, 10 days after Pearl Harbor, Australia made a decision no other ally was willing to make. It sent soldiers to Timor, violating Portuguese neutrality, without formal permission, without any guarantee of reinforcements, because time was running out and someone had to do it. The force was called Sparrow Force, 1,400 men in total. But inside those 1,400, there was a group that changes everything. 260 men from the 2nd Independent Company. Not conventional infantry. Commandos. Trained specifically to operate alone in hostile territory without a supply line. The kind of soldier who doesn't need rescuing because he never planned on being rescued. Their orders were 3. Defend the Dili airfield, protect supply routes to Australia, and if they were overrun, prolonged guerrilla. Harass Japanese supply lines with native support. That third order was the one nobody wanted to say out loud, because it meant they were already planning for the scenario where everything else had failed. Churchill knew it, MacArthur knew it, every Allied commander knew it. Japan had 15,000 soldiers ready for Timor, tanks, heavy artillery, 200 aircraft, and the first combat-tested paratroop regiment Asia had ever seen, against 1,400 Australians with 2 anti-aircraft guns. Nobody in London, Washington, or The Hague believed Timor could be defended. The question wasn't whether Japan would take the island, it was when. But here's the but. Timor couldn't simply be handed over. Every week Japan took to consolidate the island was a week Australia had to reinforce Darwin, to move aircraft, to reorganise the South Pacific. Someone had to buy that time, and nobody wanted to be that someone. On the 20th of February 1942, Japan launched Operation H. Simultaneous, coordinated, brutal. In West Timor, 4,000 soldiers landed at Kupang, while 1,000 paratroopers from the 1st Raiding Regiment dropped on Pen Phui. The airfield the 2 over 40th Battalion had spent months defending. In East Timor, 2,000 Japanese Marines came ashore at Dili after a naval bombardment that lasted through the night. The Australians fought back. 3 days of combat at Pen Phui that Australian War Memorial Archives describe simply as fierce, position by position. No retreat until retreat was the only option left. But on the 23rd of February, the 2 over 40th Battalion was surrounded at Irekum. No ammunition, no food, 200 casualties in 3 days. Outnumbered 5-1, the commanding officer made the only decision he had left. Formal surrender. The 23rd of February, 1942. 900 men captured, many executed in the days that followed. And in that moment, up in the mountains to the east, 260 commandos received the message that changed everything. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a carefully worded order. It was this: maintain offensive patrolling, deny Japanese use of island, link with natives. That was all. No promised reinforcements, no rescue date, no plan B. The rest of the Allied world was pulling out. Churchill was evacuating Singapore. MacArthur was abandoning the Philippines. The Dutch had signed their surrender. And 260 Australians in a jungle 500 kilometres from Darwin received 3 lines telling them to stay behind and face all of it alone. What they did over the next 10 months with those 3 lines is what makes this story something no textbook has ever fully captured. But to understand it, you first need to know why everyone else left. Because that decision, the decision to abandon Timor, wasn't cowardice. It was strategy. And that makes what the Australians chose to do even harder to explain. On the 23rd of February, 1942, while the Australian commandos were disappearing into the mountains of East Timor, the war in the west was already over. General Nape, commander of Dutch forces in West Timor, opened his radio and sent the same message to Java. They couldn't go on. 4,000 Japanese soldiers on the ground, 1,000 paratroopers dropping from the sky, the Pen Phui airfield lost on day 1, ammunition exhausted on day 2, and Java, the only place reinforcements could have come from, was being invaded at exactly the same time. Nape wasn't surrendering out of cowardice. He was surrendering because there was nowhere left to look for help. Overrun numerically, no supply lines. That was it. 2 sentences. The end of Dutch resistance in Timor, but at least the Dutch fought. The British never showed up. Not because they didn't know what was happening in Timor. They knew perfectly well. But Winston Churchill had made a decision long before the first Japanese paratrooper hit the ground. Asia was a secondary priority. Europe first. North Africa first. The Mediterranean first. Timor was an island 500 kilometres from Australia, and Australia wasn't the centre of the war Churchill was fighting. Singapore fell on the 15th of February, 1942, 5 days before the invasion of Timor. 85,000 British soldiers captured in what Churchill himself called the greatest disaster in British military history. There were no troops, no ships, no political will to defend an island that from London looked like a tiny dot on an ocean that was too big to manage. Timor wasn't a priority. Timor was nothing. But here's the but. While Churchill was focused on Europe and the Dutch were signing their surrender, there was one man whose decision mattered more than anyone else's in the Pacific. And that man was in Australia. Douglas MacArthur arrived in Australia in March 1942. Having fled the Philippines by torpedo boat, he left behind 76,000 American and Filipino soldiers who would be captured at Bataan. He was welcomed as a hero. And as Supreme Commander of the Southwest Pacific area, his word was law. By February 1942, the logic was already clear. By June 1942, he made it official. Timor was not going to be retaken. General Thomas Blamey, commander of Allied land forces, laid it out to Canberra in 3 arguments that couldn't be argued with. First, Retaking Timor required a division-level amphibious operation, a minimum of 10,000 men, landing craft, air cover, weeks of planning. Second, Japan controlled the sea around Timor. Any rescue convoy would be detected and destroyed before reaching the coast. Third, New Guinea and Guadalcanal were the priority. That's where the Pacific was going to be won or lost, not on a small island that was already gone. MacArthur approved. Pure waste of time. Those were his exact words about retaking Timor. And with 4 words, Douglas MacArthur sealed the situation of 260 men who had been fighting alone in a jungle 500 kilometres from Darwin for weeks. No rescue was planned. No reinforcements were coming. Nobody was looking at Timor. And then there's Portugal. This is the part of the story that appears least in the history books. Portugal was neutral in the Second World War. East Timor was a Portuguese colony. And when Australia occupied Dili on the 17th of December 1941, violating that neutrality, Lisbon formally protested. There was a secret agreement. The Allies would withdraw. Portugal would send its own troops from Mozambique to restore colonial order. Those troops left on the 28th of January 1942. They arrived after the 20th of February. After the Japanese invasion, Japan had justified its own invasion using exactly that argument, restoring the neutrality that Australia had violated. And when the Portuguese troops finally arrived, they found an island that belonged to nobody except Japan. The neutrality that was supposed to protect East Timor was the pretext Japan used to take it. 3 weeks between Lisbon's departure and Dili's arrival. 3 weeks that changed everything. On the 23rd of February 1942, while the Dutch were signing their surrender and MacArthur was reorganising his priorities, someone in Melbourne had to write the orders for the 260 men left alone in the mountains of East Timor. The orders said this: maintain guerrilla operations, deny Japanese airfield usage, link with Portuguese regulars and natives, no evacuation contemplated. And the last line: no evacuation contemplated. 4 words that in military language mean one thing only: you're on your own, permanently. The Dutch surrendered because they had no other option. The British never came because they had other priorities. MacArthur said it was a waste of time. Portugal arrived too late, and 260 Australians received a piece of paper telling them nobody was coming. But here's what none of those decisions could calculate. Nobody asked them if they wanted to stay, because they'd already decided for themselves. And that the reason 260 men chose to stay when the entire world was telling them it was suicide is what no military archive has ever fully explained. That's what comes next. The 23rd of February, 1942. The mountains of Finisterre, East Timor. Major Alexander Spence is 36 years old and has just received the message from Darwin. No evacuation, initiate guerrilla operations, deny the enemy use of airfields and ports. Spence gathered his officers. There was no debate, no vote, no long speech. Bernard Callanan, his second in command, a civil engineer turned commando, recalled it decades later in his book Independent Company. Spence didn't ask for opinions. He explained the situation. He gave the orders. The men nodded. That was it. 260 men, 1 sentence. A decision no military manual would have recommended. But here's what makes this story different from every other resistance story of the Second World War. Spence didn't stay because he had no other option. He stayed because he'd calculated they could win. Spence was a commando, not conventional infantry. And that completely changes how you read a map. Where a conventional general saw a trap, 260 men against 15,000 on an island with no exit, Spence saw 3 advantages Japan couldn't neutralise. First, the terrain. The Ramalau Mountains reach 3,000 metres. Vertical, dense, no roads. Perfect for guerrilla warfare. impossible for conventional infantry with heavy equipment. The Japanese controlled the roads, the Australians controlled the mountains, and in a guerrilla war, mountains are worth more than roads. Second, the Timorese. From day one, the Criados, the Catholic natives of East Timor, rejected the Japanese. The religious divide was total. Buddhism and Shintoism against a Catholicism that had been deeply rooted through centuries of Portuguese colonial presence. The Timorese didn't want the Japanese on their island, and that turned every village into a source of intelligence, every family into an information network, every native into a guide who knew every trail, every mountain pass, every route that Japanese maps didn't have. Callanan wrote it in a letter to his family in May 1942. The Timorese are our eyes and ears. 260 men can kill 1,500 if we're smart. Third, the training. The second independent company had been created specifically for this scenario. They weren't conventional infantry sent to do guerrilla warfare without preparation. They were soldiers doctrinally trained to operate alone behind enemy lines without external supplies, indefinitely. Stay behind operations. That's what the manuals called it. Stay, when everyone else leaves, and keep fighting. For these men, Timor wasn't a trap. It was exactly the scenario they'd been trained for. But the strategic calculations don't explain everything. The diaries do. Spence wrote in March 1942, "Perfect men for this war. The Portuguese feed us, the natives guide us, the Japanese control the roads, we control the mountains. 10 to 1 doesn't matter in guerrilla warfare." There's no fear in those lines. There's an engineer evaluating a problem. Callanan wrote to his family in May, "We are not martyrs, we are practical men." And Private Tom Dunkley, in April 1942, wrote something that says it all with fewer words. Spence says we won't all die. The Criados bring rice and meat, the Japanese are dying from malaria, so are we. But we carry on. So are we. But we carry on. That sentence captures something that appears in no military leadership manual. It wasn't invulnerability. It wasn't fanaticism. It was the conscious decision to outlast the enemy knowing both sides were suffering equally. There's one more factor, and it's the one that appears least in the official documents. 15 days before Spence gathered his officers in the Finisterre Mountains, 85,000 Allied soldiers had surrendered in Singapore. Among them, 15,000 Australians. Churchill called it the greatest disaster in British military history. In Australia, they called it something else. A disgrace. Callanan articulated it years later with the precision of someone who had been there. After Singapore, we would not be the next surrender. We would not be the next surrender. 6 words that explain why Spence didn't ask for opinions. Why the men nodded without debate. Why? 260 Australians in a jungle 500 kilometres from Darwin decided to stay against everything military logic recommended. It wasn't suicide. It was a statement. But what they did during the 10 months that followed with that statement, the raids, the ambushes, the native network, the radio that Darwin never expected to hear again, that turns this story into something more than courage. It turns it into one of the most effective guerrilla campaigns of the entire Second World War. And it starts with something no military manual had anticipated. An intelligence network built by people who had never seen a military map in their lives. 10 months. 40 Australians killed. 1,500 Japanese killed. That ratio doesn't exist anywhere else in the Second World War. Not in the Pacific, not in Europe, not in North Africa. Nowhere. But here's the but. They didn't do it alone. In the first week of March, 1942, Spence organised the structure that would keep his men alive for the 10 months ahead. No fixed base, no front line, no ammunition depot. The doctrine was simple. Hit, disappear, move before they can respond. 4 to 6 men, Bren guns and 303 rifles, position 50 meters from the road, wait for the convoy, fire for 30 seconds, withdraw up the mountain before Japanese reinforcements could arrive. 30 seconds of fire, hours of retreat through terrain that only they knew. The Japanese controlled the roads, but roads are useless when you can't move along them. In April 1942, the engineers of the Second Independent Company blew the main bridge at Rilako. The Dili to Bobonaro route, the main Japanese supply artery in East Timor, was cut for 2 weeks. That was one of more than 20 bridges destroyed during the campaign. 20 bridges, no artillery, no air support, with improvised mines and Mills grenades. May 1942. Lecluta, a Japanese patrol of 200 men moving through a narrow valley. The Australians let them in. 47 Japanese killed in the ambush, 0 Australian casualties, 0. In June, a commando team entered Dili at night. They came out with Japanese intelligence documents, and they left behind something the archives describe with a coldness that stops you cold. 1 fewer Japanese officer, but the most decisive raid of the entire campaign came in August 1942, the fuel refinery. A total fire. 3 months with no Japanese air operations in Timor. 3 months in which the Australians moved across the island with a freedom they had no right to have. All of this with light weapons. Not a single cannon, not a single support aircraft. But there's something the casualty numbers don't tell. And it's the part of this story that's hardest to read. Private Tom Dunkley wrote it in his diary with the honesty of a man who knows exactly what he's saying. Without the Timorese, we'd have been dead in 2 weeks. They saved our lives. They paid for it with their villages burned. 20,000 Timorese directly involved in the campaign. Guides who knew every trail in the Ramalao. Carriers who moved rice, ammunition and mountain ponies between bases that changed every week. Scouts who reported convoy movements 24 hours in advance. And fighters. Children and adults who fought alongside the Australians in ambushes. Photographer Damien Parra documented something that Allied military planners had never anticipated in any operational plan. Timorese children carrying Bren guns under fire. And Japan responded to that collaboration with systematic brutality. Every village suspected of helping the Australians burned. Every man under suspicion executed. Torture, massacres. Between 40,000 and 60,000 Timorese killed during the Japanese occupation. On an island with fewer than 500,000 inhabitants, 1 in 10 Timorese dead, because they helped 260 Australians stay alive. On the 19th of April 1942, a radio operator in Darwin heard something nobody expected. A signal from Timor. "We're still fighting. We need batteries." The radio, which the men called Winnie the War Winner, had been built and modified by the Commandos themselves. A piece of emergency engineering that connected 260 men to the outside world for 10 months. Darwin responded with 12 supply drops from aircraft, ammunition, medicine, batteries. Royal Australian Navy submarines patrolling the southern coast for emergency contact. It wasn't enough to win, but it was enough to keep going. August 1942. Japan had had enough. 5,000 soldiers launched in a coordinated offensive against the mountains, not to take ground, to break something far more important. The Timorese network. Systematic massacres, village by village. Every family suspected of contact with the Australians. It worked. Not completely, but enough. The intelligence networks that had kept the Australians one step ahead of the Japanese for 6 months began to fragment. The Timorese, who had risked everything, were starting to fear a price they could no longer afford to pay. Callanan, who had by then assumed command after Spence's medical evacuation, wrote it in 3 words that say it all. Timor was bleeding for us. And then he made the hardest decision of the entire campaign. Not an attack decision, not a tactical decision, the decision to leave. But here's what makes that decision even harder to understand. Not everyone could leave. The 1st of December, 1942. 10 months after the world left them behind, a ship appeared in the darkness. The Dutch destroyer HNLMS Guerrilla, guided by the same radio that had kept Darwin informed for 10 months. Winnie the War Winner, transmitting one last time from the mountains. 62 men evacuated in the first operation, 200 Portuguese civilians as well. But here's the but. On the 1st of December 1942 HMAS Armidale, the ship that was supposed to cover the rescue operations, was sunk by Japanese aircraft. 16 days of delay. 16 days in which the men waiting for evacuation remained in the jungle while Japan intensified its search. Between the 11th and 18th of December, the Churchill returned. The bulk of the second independent company, 190 men, was evacuated. And in January 1943, an American submarine, USS Gudgeon, picked up the last 6 men. The intelligence team that had stayed behind until the Japanese were too close, 254 of the original 260 made it back to Australia. 40 didn't. But what came after the evacuation is the part of this story that's hardest to tell. When the last Australian disappeared over the horizon, Japan turned to face the Timorese. It wasn't improvised, it was systematic. The 48th and 39th Japanese divisions burned more than 400 villages, mass executions, forced labour, deliberate destruction of crops to cause famine. Every family that had hidden an Australian, every guide who had led commandos through the mountains, every child who had carried ammunition in the rain. A Timorese survivor, interviewed decades later, said it plainly. The Japanese killed my family because we hid Australians. Children were beheaded. Between 40,000 and 60,000 Timorese dead. 1 in every 10 people on the island. The criados, the children who had carried Bren guns, who had run messages between bases, who had guided the Australians through trails the Japanese never found, were hunted down systematically. The Australians had mentioned them in official reports. Good boons. 2 words. In a military document, to describe the children who saved their lives. No formal recognition for any Timorese for decades. No medal. No official acknowledgement. Nothing to document that 40 to 60,000 of their dead were a direct consequence of the decision to help 260 Australians who had arrived on their island in December 1941. But while Timor bled, something had shifted on the map of the war. Japan had sent 2 full divisions to an island it considered secondary. 15,000 soldiers, immobile, chasing ghosts in the mountains for 10 months. 10 months in which those 15,000 soldiers were not in New Guinea, not in Guadalcanal, not in the theatres where the Pacific was actually being decided. Historians calculate that the Timor campaign delayed Operation MO, the Japanese attack on Port Moresby, by 2 to 3 critical months. 2 or 3 months that the Allies used to reorganise, to reinforce New Guinea, to prepare the response that would stop the Japanese advance toward Australia. 260 men, 40 dead, 1,500 enemy casualties, ratio of 37 to 1. The most effective guerrilla campaign in the early Pacific War. Churchill, who had ignored Timor from the beginning, summarised it afterwards in 5 words. They alone did not surrender. Major Bernard Callanan received the Distinguished Service Order with bar. He wrote Independent Company in 1953, the book that for decades was the only accessible source on the campaign. Major Alexander Spence was mentioned in dispatches. Evacuated sick in November 1942, he never returned to the front. The second independent company was recommended for 2 Victoria Crosses. GHQ rejected both. Both of them. The Timorese received nothing formal for decades. No medal, no official recognition, nothing that documented that 40 to 60,000 of their dead had been the direct result of helping 260 Australians who arrived on their island one December in 1941. In 1992, Prime Minister Paul Keating travelled to Timor. Standing before the memorials of the campaign, he said something no Australian politician had ever said that clearly before: an eternal blood debt. In 1999, when Timor-Leste was fighting for its independence against Indonesian militias, Australia led the international force Interfet. It was the first time Australia deployed troops in combat since Vietnam. Many interpreted it as regional diplomacy, as strategic interest. But there was something older behind that decision. The veterans who were still alive knew exactly why Australia had to be there. Today, groups of Australians walk each year along the trails of the Ramelau Mountains. The same trails the Criados used to guide commandos away from Japanese patrols. In Dili, there are schools and hospitals built with Australian funding. And the older Timorese, those who heard the stories from their grandparents, still use the same name to describe the soldiers who arrived in December 1941 and didn't leave when everyone else did. The Australian spirits. The ones who didn't die. 260 men who said yes when the entire world said it was suicide. 40 who never came home. 60,000 Timorese who paid the price of that loyalty. And an island that 80 years later still calls those soldiers by the only name that makes sense for what they did: spirits. There's something about this story that history books never quite manage to capture. It's not the 37-to-1 ratio, it's not the 20 bridges blown or the 50 convoys destroyed. It's this. MacArthur said retaking Timor was a pure waste of time. Churchill never thought it was worth defending. And 260 Australians, with 3 lines of orders and no rescue date, proved them both wrong. Not with a speech, not with a declaration. With 10 months of ambushes in the jungle while the rest of the world looked the other way. There's another story just as buried as this one. A group of Australians who made a decision no military manual would have approved and changed something far bigger than a single battle. It's in the next video.